Today we are journeying through somebody's education journey, and of course if you listened earlier on, you would know by now that it's none other than Professor Yusuf Waghid, who is a distinguished South African scholar in the field of philosophy and education. He was born in District 6. He has dedicated his career to exploring themes such as democratic citizenship, Ubuntu ethics, and justice in education. Please do join me in welcoming in studio with us Professor Yusuf Waghid. Assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Wa alaikum salam, Khadija. It's been a while. Shukran for the invitation to be here, and I'm happy to be here.
No, we must say thank you for joining us, and we feel like we're going to need a few segments to journey through your education journey, but we're gonna try. We know that you began your tenure at Stellenbosch University in 1999 as a senior lecturer. You very quickly progressed through the ranks. You also served as the Dean of the Faculty of Education. You've held various visiting professorships at institutions such as Hamburg University. You're a prolific writer. You've published over, I feel like I need to take a deep breath here, 400 works, 51 academic books, and edited collections, 83 invited contributions to books. So I feel like there's a lot for us to cover. I want if you can perhaps just briefly take us back to the early days, your schooling journey.
I was at a school in District 6 called Upper Ashley Street. I attended that school, and that school I completed Standard 2 at the time, and then moved to George Golding, which is now Al Azhar. And Standard 3 was at George Golding, and then up to Standard 5, and I had a stint at Warmer Addock, because all the Standard 6s went there, and then we went to Kensington. We relocated, and I completed my matric in 1976.
In Kensington?
At Kensington High School.
And
as an expelled head boy, by the way.
Is daar 'n story wat ons moet weet van?
Because we were at the time in support of the 1976 Soweto uprisings. We felt, the two schools and the leadership at the schools, that we're gonna march down for Trekker Road, and that's when we were part of the 1976 uprisings.
To what extent did those uprisings and being at school during those years, to what extent did that shape your journey as a professional, as an academic, as a writer, as a scholar?
I think it enhanced our moral and political consciousness about why we have to pursue education. So education wasn't non-purposeful. Education had a mission. Education had some aim in mind. The Greeks love to say that education should be open-ended, about curiosity and discovery. Yet, for them even, it was about cultivating the critical mind in the market. So Socrates wasn't just poisoned because he taught people or students to be critical. He taught them to take a stand in society. And that's what the consciousness was about. So your philosophical awareness of what is happening in society and how you had to resist those who undermined and excluded you, that seemed to have been the purpose of education. So education is not just futile. It's not just facts that you acquire. It's an encounter, it's a mission, it's an experience. How you interact with others, with the context, with the environment. And that's often the misconception about what education is. Many people think that education is about personal acquisition, but it's how you relate to others in society and what change you can actually contribute to. That seems to be more educational than the previous understanding of it.
I'm thinking exactly that within a modern society, within a liberal society, that education exactly becomes that. It's something that we sometimes speak about here, that it becomes a commodity. You enter into a particular space. You get whatever would be the minimum criteria to get into a particular institution, so you can walk away with a commodity, which is a piece of paper, and that commodity serves you first. And of course, if one thinks about the way that it serves, you are deemed to be successful in having acquired this commodity if it brings you material gains, monetary benefits. When you start off the conversation now, you refer to Socrates, you refer to philosophers. In your view, of course, having taught and having written and researched extensively, is that exactly what's absent? These other elements, the multifacetedness of education as an experience, the way you term it now?
I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head when you talk about the commodification of education, of knowledge. Because together with the commodification of knowledge, you have the neoliberalization of knowledge, meaning that you market knowledge and sell it in order to make profit. But that's often the technical aspect of knowledge that you focus on. But knowledge has something which we call substance, mana, meaning, something that has to create a change within the inner self, within you, before you can even think about actuating change in society. And that's why philosophers will always say, do not just look at the external paraphernalia of knowledge, what ramifications it can bring about, how many students you can get at your institution, how many A's or B's you can achieve, but look at what education can do to the minds of students. In other words, how education can influence the understandings of knowledge they acquire. Because if they have, as one of my teachers, Naguibul Attaz, will always argue for, if they have proper understandings of knowledge, they will act properly in society. It's because they have some misconstrued understanding of what knowledge is, they often end up pursuing indefensible forms of knowledges in their practices. I don't know if I become too pedantic or complicated there. What I'm saying, if one's understanding of education is flawed, it invariably results in defective ways in which education lives or knowledge lives itself out in society. So the way you live as a person, as a Muslim, depends on the understanding of knowledge you have. And if the knowledge that you've acquired is defective, if meanings of knowledge do not impact you, then it will live itself out differently in society. So often one wonders, why is it that students behave in particular ways? Why are we so obsessed about the prophetization of knowledge? It is because one's understanding is influenced by a notion that you need to acquire knowledge to make profit. So if that understanding of knowledge is defective, which it is, then it lives itself out. It manifests itself in those kinds of ways which is disadvantageous to societal development.
Now I'm wondering, Prof, again to take you back a few years when you finished matric. Now I'm wondering, in terms of then, because back then our parents didn't necessarily have the access to the formal education that our offspring may have, and yet, yes, the wisdom and the knowledge in a different type of format. And so it's interesting that you mentioned, and what I'm getting from what you're saying is that if knowledge, if it's if the intentionality behind gaining that or pursuing that knowledge, it's about that, because then one will see it enacted in ways in which will positively impact society. And that's, to an extent, if we look at some of the role models that I think back to back then I see that in the way in which it was enacted. There weren't well-defined theories necessarily, and perfectly worded and articulated concepts. And I'm not romanticizing those years. I'm saying there's a place for formal qualifications. But the reason why I'm saying it also in that way is, were there then particular role models in your life that maybe with hindsight you realize how deeply those people impacted on the way in which you viewed life and the way in which you approached your own scholarship?
Yeah, that's for me a very salient point to raise about the whole issue about production of knowledge. So we think sometimes erroneously, maybe, that there's a particular person in our lives. There's that single person. Perhaps yes, but there are multiple ways in which we are influenced in society, and I can mention three. The first one would be the people that I've encountered in my life. So they might have been individuals who were very charismatic in society. I knew an imam at the age of 10 years old who was so charismatic with his recitation that I thought nobody would be able to match his recitation. He was just phenomenal. So I would run to the Alice Mere Street Mosque just to listen to him, because that's the madrasa I attended. So I wanted to listen to him, but this is the important dimension. Then I began to realize, if I think about it today, but the understanding of knowledge he propounded was one that manifested communally. So it was not for him a concern that I need to recite so beautifully, harmoniously alone.
Yeah.
I had to ensure that this way of recitation becomes ubiquitous in society, that many others should do it. So in that sense, knowledge becomes a communal act, an act of doing things together. And that's why people like him, can I mention his name?
Of course, of course.
I think the late Imam Simon I'm talking about, he's such a instrumental person in my life.
It's important for us to mention the name.
So that's why he would encourage us to do recitations in groups. And then we used to visit the whole of District 6 to put our prowess, our skills, our capacities to read to public scrutiny. But so it's not just an individual act of knowledge display, it's a collective communal act. So, I mean, we make a lot of the concept of Ubuntu today, but that kind of communality was already prevalent in the early days of life in Cape Town. Yeah. So I think if I think about that little understanding in my youth, how we used to go to a madrasa, for instance, or to a school, and how we used to support others in their schooling, in their understanding. So some of my students would ask me, how is it possible for you just to come up with a book, an anthology of essays in a book? And then I would always think back, maybe it's your early days. Yeah. Maybe that's where the seeds were planted. And that's how we developed. Because your attenuation to communal life in your early days must have impacted the way you think about scholarship today. Yeah. So a lot of I think a lot about this and try to make these connections. So if I entered Haji Ismail's house and went to him to tell him maybe the lines are too long, I can help to get them all away. And he agreed to it. That's how you develop that confidence and that love for interactive knowledge production. And I can see it in the students I've supervised, I've worked with, even after their PhDs, they will always remind me that what they value is that we still recognize, not just we still recognize our capacities to do things together, to do things in association. And that's where my my focus on this concept of ta'aruf has become so accentuated, because I think Muslim scholars have made a lot of concepts like ta'deeb and ta'aleem and tarbiyah, which means education, learning, of course, and good living. But the Quranic concept in Surah Al-Hujarat, ta'aruf, made me sit back again and say, but if you look at the roots and the translation of that particular concept, it actually means to live in association with one another. So, associational living, which is the translation which I have articulated somewhere else, associational living is at the heart of good education. That's actually the point I want to make. And if you do things together, not just collectively, because in a collective you can have some who do very little and others who do more. Often we talk about group work, and then you have people who are very pronounced, who talk a lot, and others are then dismissed into silence. That's often with collectivity. But in associational living, you have people who are all willing to contribute. I say they are all willing to make a contribution based on their willingness to speak their minds, based on their willingness to exercise what one French philosopher calls, based on their willingness to come to speech. So I think if I think about my own upbringing as a communal being, that is what influences your understanding of how you write, how you see things in the world, how you become interconnected and intertwined. And of course, that concept is not without ambiguity, without contradiction. Sometimes we want to work so much together, and then we become so, at times, disenchanted or antagonistic towards one another. But then we have to work again to try and subdue and undermine our own sense of antagonism.
But this enchantment should be part of the process.
Yeah.
It shouldn't deplete or defeat us in that moment. I want to latch on to something that you said, this idea of knowledge being a communal exercise. It's something that ought to impact society, that's not about the self-enrichment. And as you're talking, I'm thinking again about these universal values that we speak about as people of faith, that we find within our scriptures, but it's universally beneficial. That we were created to be part of a collective and to continually, yes, work on the self, but then of course through knowledge and the centrality, of course, that knowledge plays within our lives. Then something else that you speak about when you mention, for example, the the collective is the very fact that Ubuntu, you mentioned the word specifically. I mean, it's something that often comes up in your writing, and then of course, as you explain now, it's rooted within Islamic concepts. But also very importantly, how so many of your books and your writings comes from your life experiences. And that's an important part of enacting how knowledge is not a commodity, how it's not about the profit margins, how it's not about the neoliberalization of knowledge. Because that certainly comes across in your writings.
Yeah, you're right. I think a lot of who we are and speak about is how we present ourselves. Sometimes we ask the question, who am I? What then we think about the question, now, what does that question mean? So who am I? The question that should be asked is not who am I? The question is, what do you represent? Because you can know the identity of a person, you can know where the person resides, you can know the food the person enjoys, you can know the person's favorite book, but that doesn't give you the authority to know who the person is. You can only know the person if you experience the person, if you encounter the person. So it's not a matter of knowing who the person is, it's a matter of how do I understand the representation of the person, how the person presents herself or himself. So for me, it was never about who my students are. For me, it was how do they present themselves? If they present themselves as individuals who want to make a difference through their writing, in their communities, in their practices, which can be pedagogical, teaching and learning, or management, or at their institutions, that's who they present. They present themselves in that way. And I always said, don't be too over ambitious to tackle the entire world. For example, if a student pursues a PhD, I said, why do you think you must change the entire world? Just focus on a minute aspect of human or non-human life and then try to make a difference. Leave the rest. We are still reading works of luminaries in the past. We're still reading the works of Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, Al-Farabi. We're still reading them and we are reinterpreting them in different contexts. They perhaps didn't know that we're still going to read them. Al-Ghazali didn't know that Ihya Ulumuddin would be such a phenomenal text, that we are still reinterpreting it today. And that's the emphasis, reinterpretation. What somebody else saw and articulated and formulated in their own words, those ideas, thoughts, practices change because others interpret those same ideas differently. So you don't have to worry how many people are going to cite you, how many people are going to talk about you. It will come. I think I always think about the educationist Paulo Freire. When analytical philosophers, they thrive on criticizing Freire for his phenomenal book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But that book seems to have been cited so many times that Freire even expected him to be cited so many times, in fact, posthumously after his death. So the point is, we should not worry how we would impact the world today we should rather focus on doing good to ourselves and society, and then the world would take care of itself.
Yeah.
And that's what I learned from the Freudian text. I always say, pursue good. Produce your book. Produce your piece of writing, whether it's a small article. The citations will be taken care of. Because if it was something good, wonderful, then that particular idea will be, I won't say everlasting, I will say that particular idea will be sustainable. That particular idea will be carried through. That particular idea will be latched on, and scholars will develop it further. So the reason why I talk like this is to say that our education is never finalized. I don't want to sound too haphazard and too loose, but
Is that an end point?
there's no finality about our learning, our improvement. In a form, a couple of years ago, I was very reluctant even to say that I'm a philosopher of education. Because for me, a philosopher of education is that kind of expertise that is always in the making, that you can never reach finality about it. So that's how I understand knowledge, and that's why for me the Quran is a text for all times, because you can interpret it differently, it has different impacts, and it's endurable.
Very interestingly, Prof, we entered the previous segment, the previous half, on the point that really it's our experience that shapes and informs when we approach a text. So we're not all going to read a text in the same way, and hence our starting the conversation around your own background, your own educational background, who and what shaped and informed, and what experiences shaped and informed how you. As you traversed your life, and you raised that point also, that even when you were writing, even in your books, it was really about your experiences, and that's such an important point, given the when you mentioned the fact that yes, the prophetization of knowledge, when we speak about knowledge as a commodity. You were a teacher for a long time, and then you went into the academy. You spoke earlier on around how you also had your how you approach the idea of philosophy in education and being labeled, quote unquote, as such, with a bit of caution. But clearly, African philosophy does bring a lot of value to the global conversation. Explain to us, what is this value? How do we see, what does this value look like in tangible terms within our surrounds?
So, teaching, through teaching, and teaching is never divorced from learning. So as I taught, I learned. And so as learners learn, so they invariably teach as well. There's this interconnection between teaching and learning. So that's never separated. So in my later works, I always talk about teaching hyphen learning, because I don't see how the terms can ever be separated. In my own teaching, I've learned how to approach problems, because the subjects I taught for 15 years at a high school involved physics and chemistry. So that's my induction into the profession. I was initiated into problem solving. And when I completed my first PhD, it was in analytical philosophy of education. So what does analytical philosophy of education do combined with problem solving? A lot. Because in analytical philosophy, you begin to analyze concepts, ideas, problems. But then you look at the ramifications of your analyses for society. So, to give an example, if if there's a problem on the African continent of, let's say, dictatorship, then we ask the question, analytically, how do we know there's a dictatorship? We know there's a dictatorship because societies are repressed and excluded and denied from speaking their voices. So that's the justification for saying the problem is what it is. Now, what do philosophers of education do? They say, if you want to ensure that dictatorships are resisted, are opposed, then you have to find out first why the problem of dictatorship is, what it is, and where it is found.
And why it exists in the first place.
Exactly.
Oh my word.
So that's what analytical philosophers do. They don't just tackle the problem. They first ascertain why the problem is a problem.
So society has to, they have to be conditioned to be a certain way. Oh, okay.
And once you've analyzed the problem and given your response, you seem to have done your work. So that's what analytical philosophers do. Of course, there's criticism that analytical philosophers, they do not really bring about change in society. Well, change is not always immediately visible. Change happens over time. A dictatorship didn't just happen instantly. It took years to culminate in society. Like apartheid education, and it didn't just happen. It took many, many years before apartheid became legislation, and so it took many years before it was eradicated. And we still have a democratic society, but the democratic society is being challenged all the time because no understanding of society is ever infallible, is ever without errors or mistakes or faults. Nothing is infallible. So the work that we do is to analyze what are the major problems that the world is confronted with at the moment. And then we suggest how society ought to respond. And that's all we do. That's all we can do.
That's it. Simple. But I think probably then as that analytical philosopher, when one unpacks it in that way, as you say, it's not the job, quote unquote, of the analytical philosopher to say this is how we will fix it. But the explanation, because again, and this is so evident within a modern society that we are reactionary momentarily. We see something now, so there's this idea of instant gratification, but it's also instant problem solving. So in every way, we want that. And that's very important what you mentioned now, the idea of long term and how things build up. And we are often so disconnected.
I can give you an example in education. There's often this misunderstanding that rote learning is not good for society. Who says so? Memorization is not good for society. Memorization is very good for society. If you memorize, I can think of a simple example. You cannot write chemical formulae, equations, if you don't memorize the periodic table, for instance. Those who know a little bit of chemistry, basic chemistry. So if you memorize the symbols, you would be able to know the names of the elements. You have to know the names. So those are the things you must memorize. You can't perform prayer if you are not able to recite Surah Fatiha. You have to memorize Surah Fatiha. You can't make a dua if you don't commit yourself to memorizing it. So memorization is very good, but memorization is not the only form of learning. That's one form of learning which is foundational, which is necessary. It's better now, the aircon. But that form of learning can be more enhanced if learning is also about questioning, if learning is also about challenging, if learning is also about disagreeing, learning to disagree, learning to dissent, learning to oppose the other's argument. And that's what we call critical learning. So for me, the combination of learning would then be combine rote learning with critical learning.
Do you feel that is absent today, that these the concepts, yes, like critical thinking, but also values like kindness, like compassion, like justice, that and having taught at school many years ago, do you think that's missing? And then if it is, how can this be imparted? Because one can't say necessarily that it's taught. How can this be imparted in meaningful ways so that learners walk away not just, in these little silos, I'm a scientist, I'm a philosopher, this is what I am.
The challenge is we have teachers standing in our classrooms. If you ask directly how the problem about pedagogy can be resolved. If it's a problem, it's a problem. But how it can be addressed depends on the initiation of the teacher. But equally, I would argue, learners should be provided opportunities to disagree with you. Because if you don't encourage learners to disagree with you as the teacher, then you never give them an opportunity to question you. And if you don't create those conditions, how would you ever cultivate critical learning? So critical learning only arises when learners are taught to disagree. And by teaching them to disagree is to provoke them, to arouse within them the capacities they have to disagree. I refer to that as you have to evoke their potentialities to disagree. It's a word that I've borrowed from the famous philosopher of education, the American scholar Maxine Green, who says you have to arouse the interests of students so that they can disagree. And by arousing them is to provoke them.
Yeah.
Insist. Disagree.
To get a response.
To get that a resistant response, which is not a destructive response, but rather an oppositional response so that you can have disagreement. So when people deliberate, it's not just about reaching a consensus, agreement. It's also about reaching a dissensus, a disagreement, because out of the disagreement can emerge a better consensus. If one reaches a consensus, you might think now the problem has been resolved, but you actually haven't thought through the problem. So why not focus on reaching a dissensus so that you can think more through the problem and arrive at a better consensus?
Is debating ought to be part of that process.
Yes, yes. I call it deliberation,
Yes.
because debate is always, I must out argue you. I must produce the better claim. But deliberation is the willingness to listen to the claims of the other.
And so it becomes an engagement.
Engagement.
Yeah.
And what I would call a legitimate encounter. brings us back to education. So you're right to say that our education might be flawed, and if you want to address the education, begin by introducing the notion of the census into the conversation.
That's such an apt point for us to finish up on. I can't believe our technician is indicating that our time is up, but inshallah we'll continue. There's much that we still need to unpack. Professor Yusuf Waghid, we say thank you so much for joining us in studio today and sharing really just glimpses of your own journey and sharing your insights.
Shukran, and for the opportunity, and it was a pleasure to think through some of these thoughts again.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.